It all began on a chilly evening in a neighborhood that had seen better days. The streets were quiet, but the kind of quiet that makes you uneasy, like the world was holding its breath. She had always been someone who noticed things most people walked past. The stray cat huddled behind a dumpster, the old man shuffling along with groceries, or the kids in worn-out shoes laughing as if the world hadn't taught them harsh lessons yet. But that night, she noticed something different. For children, no older than 12 or 13, were sitting on the curb, their small frames pressed together as if the warmth from one another could protect them from the biting cold. Their clothes were tattered, shoes scuffed, and faces painted with the kind of weariness that belonged to someone twice their age. They didn't notice her at first, they rarely did, but when her car slowed and she parked across the street, their eyes met hers. There was a moment, a brief exchange that spoke more than words ever could. Fear, suspicion, and an unspoken plea for help. She had lived her life with a strong sense of empathy, believing that even the smallest act of kindness could change the course of someone's life. She wasn't wealthy, nor did she live in a grand house, but she had what mattered most: a stable home, a steady job, and a heart willing to extend itself to those in need. She stepped out of the car, her boots crunching on the frost-covered pavement, and walked toward the children. They instinctively recoiled, as if the world had taught them to expect harm from anyone who approached. But she spoke gently, using a voice that carried warmth and patience. She asked them their names, where they had come from, and why they were out there in the cold. Their answers were hesitant, fragmented, and full of holes, but one thing was clear: they had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and no idea if anyone in the world cared about them. In that moment, she made a decision. She could have called the authorities, left them to whatever fate the night might bring, or even convinced herself that helping them would be too complicated. But she didn't. Something inside her, a deep sense of responsibility and humanity, would not allow her to walk away. She offered them a ride, and after a long pause, they accepted, their relief mingled with disbelief. They climbed into her car, carrying only a few worn possessions, and she drove them to her home. The house wasn't big, but it was warm and full of life. She had bedrooms to spare, food to share, and a willingness to open her doors and her heart to strangers who, in that moment, felt like they might be her family forever. The first days were awkward. The children were wary, testing boundaries, unsure of what it meant to be safe or loved. They had lived in a world where survival often required suspicion, where trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. She didn't rush them. She let them eat, sleep, and simply exist without pressure or judgment. She spoke to them about school, chores, and the small routines that formed the backbone of a stable life. She encouraged them to tell their stories, though they often spoke in fragments, skipping the parts that were too painful. Slowly, over meals and evenings by the fire, they began to open up. They told her about being passed from relative to relative, about nights spent on park benches, about hunger that gnawed at their bellies and the fear that never left their hearts. And she listened. She didn't offer empty promises, but she offered something far rarer: consistency. She showed up every day, quietly and reliably, proving that she would not abandon them the way the world had. Her decision wasn't without its challenges. Taking in 4 children at once, especially those who had been through so much trauma, required patience, energy, and courage she didn't always feel she had. There were arguments, tears, and nights when it seemed like nothing she did would reach them. Yet every small breakthrough, a smile, a shared laugh, a bedtime story read without complaint, felt monumental. She began to see them not just as children in need, but as individuals with dreams, fears, and unique personalities. There was Marcus, the eldest, whose protective instincts toward his younger siblings reminded her of a young man she once knew. Little Aaliyah, quiet and observant, who sketched everything she saw. Twins Jamal and Jordan, full of energy and mischief, who tested every rule in the book, but whose laughter could fill a room. Each day brought new lessons for her as much as for them, teaching her resilience, empathy, and the boundless capacity of a human heart willing to give without expecting anything in return. By the end of the first month, the house felt different. It was louder, messier, but alive in a way it had never been before. The children were no longer strangers, but part of a fragile, newly formed family unit. And though she didn't know what the future would hold, she had made a choice. She would take them in, raise them, and fight for their well-being, because in that moment, she believed that love, persistent, patient, and unwavering, could change everything. Once the children had settled into her home, it became clear that taking them in wasn't just about providing shelter. It was about becoming someone they could rely on, someone who could fill the void their lives had been missing for so long. She knew that being a mother figure meant far more than feeding them, giving them clothes, or tucking them into bed at night. It meant showing up every day with patience, understanding, and a willingness to absorb the weight of their pain without letting it crush them. Each child carried their own scars, and she approached each one with a sensitivity that went beyond mere compassion. She paid attention to the subtle signs, the way one would flinch at a raised voice, the way another would shrink back when anyone reached for a hug, the way the twins would argue endlessly not just out of mischief, but because they were testing the limits of trust in a world that had repeatedly let them down. Her days became a balancing act between nurturing and discipline. She established routines, homework after school, chores before dinner, quiet time in the evenings, but she also carved out moments just for connection. Sometimes it was reading together, other times it was simply sitting in the kitchen as they shared stories of their past. She listened without judgment, never pushing them to speak more than they were ready to, but gently encouraging them to trust that their experiences, even the painful ones, mattered. Slowly, she became the anchor in their chaotic lives, the one constant they could count on. And as she watched them grow, she realized that love wasn't just about providing. It was about believing in them when they had stopped believing in themselves. Education became a cornerstone of her guidance. She enrolled them in school, made sure they had the supplies they needed, and checked in daily to track their progress. She celebrated every small victory, a good grade, a compliment from a teacher, a shy smile when they finally grasped a difficult concept. But she also handled the setbacks with grace, helping them understand that failure didn't define them, and that mistakes were just steps along the path of growth. She sought out mentors, tutors, and opportunities for enrichment, often going above and beyond what her modest income allowed. She wanted them to see that the world could offer possibilities, that life could extend beyond the streets and shelters they had known, and that they could aspire to more than mere survival. Her care extended far beyond academics. She taught them life skills, how to cook a meal, manage money, and advocate for themselves in a world that didn't always reward kindness or effort. She guided them through social situations, teaching them how to navigate friendships, handle conflicts, and recognize both genuine and harmful intentions in others. She encouraged them to explore hobbies and talents, whether it was drawing, playing sports, or learning an instrument. Every new interest she nurtured became another building block of their confidence and sense of identity, helping them understand that they were more than the sum of their hardships. At home, she established a sense of safety and structure that had been absent from their lives. Arguments still happened, tempers flared, and tears were shed, but there was always the understanding that beneath it all was love that would not abandon them. She modeled resilience, showing them that life could be difficult, yet still full of hope. She shared her own experiences, times when she had struggled, failed, and learned to stand back up. And in doing so, she normalized vulnerability while demonstrating strength. She never forced them to become what she thought they should be. Instead, she guided them toward becoming their best selves, providing tools, encouragement, and the occasional firm correction when needed. Her influence began to ripple outward in ways she hadn't anticipated. The children started to thrive in school, make friends, and engage in community activities. Their behavior changed not because of fear of punishment, but because they had learned what it felt like to be cared for, to be seen, and to be valued. They began to mirror the lessons she had instilled: responsibility, empathy, and resilience. Even the neighbors noticed the transformation. The kids who had once been invisible, wandering the streets, now walked with a quiet confidence. They laughed more freely, joked with one another, and even looked forward to coming home each day. Yet she understood that her role was ongoing, never finished. Being a mother figure wasn't a title. It was a daily commitment, a choice to remain patient even when progress was slow, to remain steadfast even when setbacks occurred, and to keep hope alive even when the world seemed determined to remind them of its harshness. Every meal prepared, every question answered, every scraped knee bandaged, and every word of encouragement spoken was a thread weaving the fabric of a family that had once been broken, teaching the children what it meant to belong, to be loved, and to be supported unconditionally. As the years passed, the children she had taken in began to grow, and with each passing day, the woman watched them transform in ways she had only dared to hope for. Marcus, once quiet and withdrawn, developed a quiet confidence, taking on responsibilities around the house and looking out for his younger siblings as if he were their protector. Aaliyah, who had once sketched only the shadows of her life on scraps of paper, began to fill notebooks with drawings full of color and imagination, her creativity blossoming under the gentle encouragement she received. Jamal and Jordan, the twins, whose boundless energy had once tested every rule and pushed her patience to its limits, began to channel their enthusiasm into school activities and local sports leagues, learning teamwork and discipline in a way that had seemed impossible when they first arrived. The woman had never imagined that her decision to take in 4 children would demand so much from her emotionally, financially, and physically. Yet every struggle she faced was met with the reward of watching them grow stronger, more resilient, and more independent. She sacrificed countless hours of sleep, personal time, and even professional opportunities, but she never regretted it. She knew that stability and love were exactly what they had been missing, and she took pride in giving them a life that had once seemed out of reach. She attended every school meeting, cheered at every game, and stayed up late helping with homework, teaching not just the lessons from books but the lessons of life: patience, empathy, and perseverance. The home, once quiet and solitary, now buzzed with life, laughter, and the occasional argument that inevitably followed children who had learned to trust but were still discovering the boundaries of that trust. They learned to fight fair, to apologize, and to forgive, lessons that did not come easily, but were reinforced daily through her guidance. Family dinners became a sacred ritual, a time to share stories, joys, and small victories, and she made sure they understood that every voice mattered. In a world that had often told them they were invisible, they began to see themselves as important, capable, and worthy. Through the challenges, she maintained an unwavering belief in their potential. She had encountered moments when the kids doubted themselves, when past trauma made it hard for them to trust or try something new, and when the weight of their experiences threatened to hold them back. In those moments, she did not scold or berate. She reminded them of their progress, encouraged them to take small steps forward, and celebrated even the tiniest accomplishments. She understood that growth was not linear, that setbacks were inevitable, and that her role was to be their anchor, helping them navigate the waves of adolescence and early adulthood. Beyond the walls of the home, she fought to create opportunities for them to see a world beyond their immediate circumstances. She encouraged them to join clubs, attend workshops, and participate in community events. She introduced them to mentors who could provide guidance and inspiration, expanding their horizons and planting seeds for dreams they had never dared to imagine. They began to see themselves as more than survivors. They could be artists, athletes, scholars, and leaders. The confidence she nurtured became a foundation they could build upon, a shield against the insecurities that had once dominated their lives. At the same time, she faced her own internal struggles. There were nights when she questioned whether she was doing enough, whether she could truly protect them from the harshness of the world outside. There were moments of exhaustion, when balancing work, household responsibilities, and the emotional labor of guiding 4 children seemed almost impossible. Yet every time she saw Marcus helping his siblings with homework, Aaliyah sketching fearlessly, or the twins laughing together without fear, she felt a sense of purpose that outweighed any doubt. She learned to accept that perfection was impossible, but that dedication, love, and consistency could create a life far richer than mere survival. Through it all, a deep bond developed between them. A bond forged not just by the shared roof and meals, but by the countless small moments of care, trust, and sacrifice. The children learned to rely on her not as an authority figure alone, but as a protector, mentor, and unwavering supporter. They began to show empathy to one another, taking care of each other in ways they had never experienced with anyone else. The woman had not only given them stability, she had given them a blueprint for relationships built on trust, respect, and love. As adolescence approached for each child, she realized that the lives she had touched were no longer defined by the hardships of their past. Their personalities flourished, shaped by a mix of her guidance and their own emerging identities. They became individuals capable of independent thought, compassion, and ambition, ready to step into a world that had once seemed impossibly daunting. The seeds she had planted through daily care, encouragement, and unwavering love were beginning to bear fruit, and the children who had once been strangers on a cold curb were becoming the young adults she had always hoped they could be. As the years went by, life seemed to settle into a rhythm that, on the surface, looked like the kind of family story people admired in passing. The children were growing up, finding their paths, and the woman who had taken them and became a central figure in their lives, not just as a caregiver, but as someone who had shaped the very foundation of who they were becoming. For a time, it seemed as though the world had finally aligned in their favor. The chaos of their early years replaced by stability, the trauma of the streets replaced by warmth, guidance, and opportunity. Yet beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form, small, almost imperceptible at first, but gradually widening with every passing year. It started subtly. Conversations that once carried respect began to take on a tone of entitlement. Minor disagreements that could have been resolved with patience began to fester, and old patterns of manipulation and testing boundaries, buried under years of nurturing, began to resurface. The woman noticed the changes but chose to give the benefit of the doubt. After all, the kids had been through more than anyone could imagine. They had been molded by the harshness of the streets before she had met them, and some habits die slowly, no matter how much love is poured in. She believed that her role was to continue guiding, correcting, and supporting them, trusting that the foundation she had built over the years would hold firm. Over time, however, she began to notice that the dynamics in the household were shifting in ways she hadn't anticipated. Arguments grew sharper, defiance became more calculated, and subtle manipulations replaced the straightforward childhood behaviors she had grown accustomed to managing. Her patience, which had always been her greatest strength, was tested in new ways. The children, now young adults, began to navigate her rules with a strategic precision, carefully choosing when to comply and when to resist. It was no longer about mischief or youthful rebellion. It was about control, and slowly, the balance of power in the household began to tilt. She also noticed changes outside the house, in the way others interacted with them. Friends, colleagues, and acquaintances seemed to treat them differently now, with deference and expectation. They had grown charismatic, intelligent, and persuasive, but some of that energy began to be directed not toward building their own futures, but toward influencing and manipulating the woman who had sacrificed so much for them. There were moments when she questioned herself. Had she given them too much freedom, too much trust, or perhaps too much influence over her life? But whenever doubt crept in, she reminded herself of the years of growth, the achievements, the laughter, and the bonds they had formed. She wanted to believe that what they had learned under her care would guide them to make choices that honored the family she had nurtured. Yet the reality began to reveal itself in quiet, insidious ways. Small lies became patterns, hidden actions became calculated maneuvers, and her efforts to maintain harmony were met with increasing resistance. She found herself walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate their reactions, wondering whether every decision she made, what to cook, how to spend money, how to manage the household, would be met with gratitude, indifference, or subtle resentment. The trust she had built over years of nurturing, protection, and guidance was being tested in ways she could never have imagined. The turning point came gradually, through moments that seemed ordinary at the time. Conversations overheard, suspicious absences, and small betrayals accumulated into a pattern she could no longer ignore. It became clear that the children who had once relied on her for survival were now capable of actions that could dramatically alter her life. Their motivations, once transparent and innocent, were now layered with ambition, resentment, or self-interest. She had not seen it coming, not because she hadn't tried, but because her heart had always assumed the best in them. Her generosity, patience, and trust, qualities that had sustained the family for years, were now being used against her. In the quiet moments of reflection, she grappled with disbelief. How could those she had nurtured, fed, and protected be capable of undermining the very life she had worked so hard to build? Every memory of their shared struggles, every sacrifice she had made, seemed to collide with the reality that the people she had saved might now pose the greatest threat to her own well-being. The life she had given them had empowered them, but in ways that no one could have predicted. That empowerment was being turned into a force that could destroy her. The woman began to notice that the tension in the household was no longer just emotional. It carried tangible consequences. Decisions that had once been simple became fraught with risk. Trust was no longer a given, and every action had to be measured against the potential for manipulation or betrayal. She found herself constantly questioning her judgment, wondering whether years of love, sacrifice, and guidance had inadvertently created a situation where her own safety and freedom were at stake. The children who had once been helpless were now formidable, and the shift in power was undeniable. It started with small disruptions that at first seemed like coincidence or misunderstanding. Bills went missing, important documents disappeared, and minor arguments escalated in ways that felt oddly orchestrated. She tried to chalk it up to growing pains, assuming that the young adults she had raised were testing boundaries as anyone would at that age. But soon, the patterns became too precise, too deliberate, to ignore. She realized with a sinking feeling that the very people she had brought into her home, nurtured, and trusted were actively undermining her life. At first, she confronted them gently, hoping the issue could be resolved with conversation. She reminded them of the years they had spent together, the sacrifices she had made, the stability she had provided, and the guidance she had offered. But the responses she received were cold, calculated, and sometimes outright dismissive. They had learned the art of persuasion and deflection, skills they had honed in response to the harshness of the world they once lived in. And now, those same skills were being turned toward her. The home that had once been a sanctuary of love and learning became a battlefield where trust was weaponized, and every interaction carried hidden motives. Her friends and neighbors began to notice a change in her demeanor. The woman who had once been warm, confident, and unwavering was now cautious, constantly second-guessing herself, and always alert to potential threats within her own household. She had been blindsided by the very people she had saved, and the emotional toll was immense. Nights were restless, filled with worry and the gnawing question of how she could have misjudged them so profoundly. Her instincts, which had guided her through so many difficult situations, now seemed unreliable, clouded by the betrayal she could scarcely believe. As time passed, their actions became more audacious. Small acts of sabotage escalated into legal entanglements she had never imagined facing. The children she had raised, once dependent on her for guidance and protection, had acquired the means to manipulate the system in ways that left her vulnerable. Documents were altered, statements were taken out of context, and events were arranged to cast her in a negative light. Each day brought a new revelation, a new shock, a new piece of evidence that the life she had spent decades building could be stripped away almost overnight. She had tried to teach them right from wrong, the value of honesty and integrity, and the importance of gratitude, yet it seemed that lesson had been ignored or forgotten entirely. She fought to protect herself, to assert control over the narrative, but the more she resisted, the more determined they became. The home she had opened with love and trust had become a prison of tension, where every interaction carried the weight of manipulation and betrayal. Her own emotions became a battlefield. Fear, disappointment, and heartbreak battled against the instinct to defend and survive. The people she had once cradled, fed, and guided had now become agents of her undoing. Legal proceedings began quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, but the impact was devastating. They had found a way to entangle her in situations she could not control, forcing her to defend herself against charges and accusations she had never anticipated. Each hearing, each document, each courtroom visit chipped away at her confidence and sense of security. The irony was cruel. She had given them a life, a family, and a home, yet in return, she faced the threat of losing her freedom entirely. The very people who had depended on her for survival were now capable of turning her years of generosity into the chains that would confine her. Throughout it all, she clung to the memory of the first night she met them, the cold street corner where they had huddled together for warmth, eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. She remembered the hope she had carried in her heart, the belief that love could change the course of their lives, and the pride she had felt as she watched them grow into young adults. But the pride now existed alongside confusion and pain, because the very love that had guided them had also given them the tools to orchestrate her downfall. Her daily life became a careful navigation of trust and vigilance. She questioned every interaction, scrutinized every document, and re-examined every relationship. The people she had once regarded as her children had turned the lessons she had taught them into strategies, using her generosity and dedication as weapons against her. The home that had once been a refuge was now a landscape of uncertainty and danger, where every decision could have consequences she had never imagined, and every act of kindness risked being exploited. She began to understand the terrifying complexity of human relationships, the duality of gratitude and resentment, and the unpredictable ways in which loyalty can fracture. The children she had nurtured were no longer simply those in need. They had evolved into forces capable of changing her destiny, and she faced the unimaginable reality that the life she had built with care, love, and sacrifice could be dismantled by the very people who owed their lives to her. It was a cruel twist of fate that the very people she had saved, the children she had welcomed into her home, nurtured, and guided, had the power to alter her life in ways she could never have imagined. Every decision she had made for them, every meal she had prepared, every sleepless night spent comforting a scraped knee or soothing a nightmare, had been born of love and a desire to protect. She had believed that such acts would build loyalty, gratitude, and family bonds strong enough to weather anything life threw at them. But the truth she faced now was far more complicated, a reality that challenged the very assumptions she had lived by. As the legal battles intensified, as the tension in her home grew more palpable, and as every interaction carried the risk of manipulation, she began to understand that kindness could be both a gift and a vulnerability. The lessons she had taught, resilience, self-reliance, and independence, had been absorbed, not just as tools for growth, but as instruments her children could wield against her. Every argument, every challenge to her authority, every misrepresented story fed into a system that threatened to consume her life. She had opened her doors and heart without reservation, believing that love alone could shape character, but she had underestimated the complexity of human ambition, fear, and the shadows left by early trauma. The emotional weight was crushing. There were moments when she felt trapped in a reality she had built with her own hands, a life meant to be a sanctuary, now transformed into a battleground. Memories of the first days, when the children had been frightened and hungry, returned with sharp clarity. She remembered holding them close, hearing their whispered confessions of fear, and promising that nothing would ever harm them while they were under her care. The irony was bitter. Those promises, once a source of comfort and stability, now seemed to mock her, as the children she had protected were the ones threatening her freedom and security. Friends and neighbors watched with a mix of disbelief and sorrow. They had seen her pour herself into a family that wasn't hers by blood, and they had marveled at her unwavering dedication. Now, they witnessed the consequences of that devotion in real time. The woman who had given so much, who had sacrificed so much, was facing a reality she could not control, forced to confront the very vulnerability that her generosity had created. Her story, which had once been one of inspiration and hope, had taken a turn into cautionary territory, showing that even the purest intentions can carry unforeseen risks. She reflected on the nature of loyalty, trust, and the human capacity for both love and betrayal. It was a lesson she had never expected to teach herself, and one she struggled to reconcile with her lifelong belief in the goodness of people. The children she had raised had been shaped by years of guidance and support, yet they had also been influenced by their own experiences, their own ambitions, and the parts of their character forged long before she entered their lives. What she had intended as love, guidance, and stability had been received as power, leverage, and opportunity. She began to see how complicated the intersections of gratitude and resentment could be, and how easily the two could coexist within the same person. In private moments, she questioned the choices she had made, wondering whether different boundaries, stricter rules, or less exposure to vulnerability could have changed the outcome. But she also recognized that her instincts, those that had driven her to act with generosity and compassion, had created opportunities for growth and transformation in their lives that could never have existed otherwise. It was a paradox she could not resolve. The very qualities that made her remarkable as a caregiver were also the qualities that left her exposed. Even amidst fear, frustration, and heartbreak, there were moments of reflection and clarity. She thought about the years spent teaching the children resilience, compassion, and integrity, and realized that her actions had shaped who they were in profound ways. Yet, she also understood that human behavior is unpredictable and that even the deepest bonds can be tested by circumstances, ambition, or unmet desires. Her life had become a living lesson in the duality of kindness, how generosity can empower, protect, and transform, but also how it can create vulnerabilities when met with betrayal or exploitation. The woman found herself grappling with a bitter truth. Life is rarely fair, and even the best intentions do not guarantee the outcomes we hope for. She had opened her heart and home to 4 children in need, offering them love, stability, and opportunity. 2 decades later, she faced the consequences of those choices in ways she could never have anticipated, as the people she had nurtured turned her own principles into challenges that threatened to undo everything she had worked to build. Every day became a careful balancing act between hope and caution, trust and vigilance. The lessons she had imparted, the love she had given, and the sacrifices she had made had all created a tapestry of life that was both beautiful and fraught with danger. She had learned that kindness, while powerful, is not always met with gratitude, and that the outcomes of generosity can be as unpredictable as the people who receive it. Her story, once one of nurturing and protection, had transformed into a stark reminder of the complexity of human relationships and the delicate, sometimes perilous, nature of giving without limits.